Hey kids, my name is Jeremy Edward Gunther. I am about 35 years old right now. This is obviously just past Christmas time. This video is primarily for Malachi, Lily, and Corinthia Gunther, or anyone else in the family who would find it useful. You might call it a statement of faith. My concern is that in the future, many of the archaeological and various evidences for the Bible are going to start being suppressed. It will be harder to find them. I've done a great deal of research over the last 6 to 8 years, and I would like to share some of what my current understandings are in various areas of the Bible. The basis and the cornerstone of our faith is simply belief in Jesus, belief and a desire to be ruled by Jesus. Very little corruption in the Bible can ever cover up that one basic truth. Your Grandpa Gunther is probably the cornerstone of my faith. Before I really did my own studying, he is the one who inspired me, and I relied heavily on his faith. So I very much appreciate that I had a role model such as him in my life. Now, once we get past that basic faith, which anyone even without a Bible should be able to understand and know, let's start digging into why we believe that. Is there any evidence for it? Starting with the Bible, there is a lot of controversy over biblical translations. The biblical translations are generally based on Greek documents. The most recent Greek documents that we have are called the Textus Receptus and the Septuagint. The Textus Receptus is a Greek translation or a Greek collection of the original New Testament manuscripts. The Septuagint is the oldest known copy of the original Hebrew Bible in Greek. The Septuagint is probably the most accurate copy that we know of. The original Hebrew Bible was flawlessly copied by scribes for many, many years, and eventually it was copied into the Greek Septuagint. Now, I believe that there was some corruption intentionally done in the next translation that was done between the Septuagint and the modern Hebrew Bible. The modern Hebrew Bible is where all current English translations of the Bible get their Old Testament. So all of our Old Testaments have some minor flaws, nothing major that is going to directly affect your faith, but when it comes to proving biblical history or finding archaeological evidence, these errors that were introduced are just enough to throw doubt and confusion into the world. So that includes things like the Old King James and New King James. They are both based off the Textus Receptus for the New Testament, which is good. That seems to be the most accurate Greek document we have. But they're also based off of the Hebrew modern translation of the Bible rather than the original Septuagint. I believe that's probably because the original Septuagint may not have existed or been discovered when those original translations were made. I would recommend that you read some of the non-canon books of the Bible. Take them with a grain of salt. They are non-canon. Our core belief system is based on God inspiring the original Bible to be written and put together. I have currently read the book of Enoch. It is a very interesting book. One of the biggest reasons to read these books is because you're going to find a lot of conspiracy theorists out there, a lot of people saying things that just don't make sense or you don't find evidence for in the Bible. And if you've read these books, you'll at least understand where they're coming from, and you'll be able to make comparisons against these books with the actual translation of the Bible and realize where these books are perhaps a little flawed. But it is good at least to understand where these other people are coming from. It is hard to argue somebody if you've never read their base material that they are relying on for their arguments. In our modern day, we are going through a period right now where a lot of archaeological evidence, a lot of scientific data is coming to light that all backs up creationism. Everything does. To my knowledge, there is not one bit of evidence that has ever been found that actually leans in the direction of evolution. People may claim things do. People may try and fudge some data. I've definitely seen that, where they fudge the data to make it look a little bit more like evolution, or they just state facts. Incorrect facts, but they're pretending that they're facts in support of evolution. when the actual data, if you go back to the original data that these facts are supposedly built off of, they just don't support the conclusions these people are arriving at. So from that scenario, there's two belief systems out there. There's the Christian belief system based on God, and there's the evolutionary belief system. Those are two of the major ones, and not counting the other major religions of the world. And of those two, there's, in my opinion, that an evolutionary belief system requires a great deal more faith than a Christian or a faith-based in God belief system, because there's just so much evidence for God, from our DNA to the stars in the heavens to everything, especially since most of it is backed up in the Bible. I mean, the Bible doesn't lay out, this is specific scientific details for everything, but it gives such pointed hints so consistently, and they're always proven right, that it's very compelling. I would suggest that you watch as many creationist lectures as you can, both on biblical history and on studies for DNA and other things. Generally, the more interesting lectures are those done by creationists or young earth theorists, simply because they're more likely to give you the actual data. Now, usually they do tell you that they got to their conclusions through the Bible or their initial research hypothesis. The problem with the evolutionists, though, when they present their data, is they tend to present more opinion, less fact. And when you're going through these, even the creationist videos, you're looking for the facts. The opinions are fun, and you might believe some of them, or you might agree with some of them, but it's the facts that you're really looking for to build your own understanding, your own knowledge, your own belief system. Let's see here. I sent a history of the Bible to your grandmother, but I forgot to write it down. I wonder if I can find that real quick here. The Bible's gone through quite the history, and it's rather interesting. Let's skip over that while I'm looking for it here. Yes. Evolution was originally introduced when people didn't really have a lot of evidence for the Bible. We hadn't really had huge archaeological studies. There was not a lot of scientific data yet. And so it was much easier for evolutionists to say, hey, they're both belief systems. Neither one of them is very accurate. So let's go with this one because we don't want to believe in God, and there's no evidence for either one of them. So this one here is the one we like. It doesn't require a God. We don't want a God. And that's kind of when the evolutionary theory took hold in the world. Even back then, there was more evidence for creationism than evolutionism, but it wasn't quite as overwhelming as it is these days. And so it was easier for them to convince the general population of it. And ever since then, they've been in a battle to simply suppress data, because all the data that's coming to light discredits their theories. Alright, the key facts when you're looking at the Bible, this is what I've come to believe through my research. When you're looking at Jewish scribes, the Jewish scribe system of copying the Bible was almost flawless. The number of checks and counterbalances they had and the amount of time and dedication they put into the copying the Bible made it so that they made very few of any mistakes. And their mistakes were very, very minor and could be compared against other copies of the Bible back in that time to be rectified later. Those original Jewish scribes, however, stopped working about the time of Jesus or shortly before there. Once the Jewish kingdoms were conquered by various other kingdoms and eventually were taken over by Rome, which is where Jesus comes into the picture, the Jewish scribes were no longer practicing copying the Bible quite as heavily. At that point, the Jewish language was disappearing and the Greek language was taking over. So those original Hebrew translations of the Bible were very accurate. But that flawless translation ceased when the Greek language became dominant. And then we have the final translation of the Bible into the Septuagint. To my knowledge, all copies of those original Hebrew Bibles were lost. We only have a couple of minor fragments of them, and descriptions of the process the scribes used to go through to copy them. But the Septuagint is really the first full Greek manuscript that we have that actually is that original Bible, the closest thing we have to that original Bible. Yes. During the Roman occupation, this is an interesting bit of data, something happened around the time of King Herod in the Bible. The true priesthood that was passed down through Aaron's bloodline, Aaron and his sons, that was established by Moses, got replaced. So they were the ones who were dedicated to preserving all the culture, everything about Jesus. And they were replaced for political reasons by the king of the time. And fake priests were put in. Now, I'm not sure if these fake priests were even Levites. I suspect they were probably still Levites, but they were no longer the bloodline of Aaron. And they were now in power, and they wanted, power. They were no longer dedicated to the Bible or to truth. They simply wanted power. And so a lot of what we see Jesus doing in the Bible is him combating this new line of priests who were no longer the original established by God bloodline of priests. So him overturning things in the temple or criticizing the priests for their handling of virtually everything. You have to remember that he's not talking to the original bloodline that he established through Moses. He is talking to this new line of priests that was put in for political reasons. Now, after Jesus' death, a certain scribe came along. He was a leader of these priests, I believe, and he realized that Jesus had fulfilled virtually everything in the Bible. And he needed to silence the Christians who were the Christian movement that was starting to come up. He needed to silence the fact that they could point to the Bible and say, hey, look, Jesus fulfilled all these things. And so he is the one who took it upon himself and his little establishment of scribes to copy the Bible from the Septuagint into what's now the modern day Hebrew translation. Now, during this translation, it appears that he intentionally introduced multiple errors. Some of those errors were in the biblical genealogy, especially post-flood. He dropped off 100 years, which is easy for us to associate with because people don't live to be 100 years old anymore. They did back then as the human body was transitioning from pre-flood environments into modern environment, but modern day humans just don't live to be a couple hundred years old. And so it was a translation error that was very easy for people to get on board with. And it also breaks up a lot of the the historical timeline that Jesus fulfilled. He dropped the fact that the time period for the Jews to be in Egypt included the Jews being in Canaan as well, so they were actually in Egypt for a shorter period of time than the modern day Bible says, because the old original Septuagint said that the Hebrews were in both Egypt and Canaan for the time period specified, whereas the modern Bible simply says Egypt and drops off the Canaan. That comes into play when you're trying to date the time period of the Exodus and other things that happened around that period. So it throws that whole timeline into doubt, and a lot of secular historians point to that as proof that the Exodus could never have happened. There are also a bunch of verses that the scribe left out of the Old Testament. So when you're reading the New Testament, Jesus will make quotes from old prophets and say, this guy said this. And you go back and look at that prophet's writings and you can't find it anywhere. Well, it appears that this guy left out some of those quotes that Jesus was specifically referencing that he is fulfilling. That way, the Christians of the time could no longer point to the current translation of the Bible and say, hey, look, Jesus fulfilled these things, because they weren't in that translation anymore. As I'm talking about the Bible here, that term is rather loose. Don't forget that back then, it was more just a collection of scrolls. The actual Bible as we know it today wasn't put together until Roman imperial times, when the Catholic Church was coming into power. So back then, we're just talking about a loose collection of scrolls for both the Old and the New Testament. So each book of the Bible was more just a scroll. And there were lots and lots of scrolls floating around. The Book of Enoch was one of them. There were other ones as well that are no longer part of the canon, and they were read by Christians back then, and many of them believed those scrolls. It wasn't until the time period of the Catholic Church that our modern-day canon was established, which basically said these are the ones that we believe were God-inspired. Now, were they accurate when they established the canon? I don't know that that is something that we can establish for certain, but I think it is dangerous if we try and break out of that. Once you say that the current Bible is no longer canon, you're opening yourself up to a lot of disbelief. And the current Bible has been very, very accurate. So while they may have accidentally misplaced a book, and that is one of the reasons why it's good to read the non-canon books, just to understand what's in them. Our core faith, our core belief system is still based off these books that these Christians of the time period spent months researching and decided that these were the core biblical teachings. Alright, let's see here. Evidence that has been coming to pass here. The biblical flood, yes. It established the canyons and mountains and sediment layers in our world today. The evolutionists like to say that took millions of years, but more recently we had, actually, I think it was in my lifetime, definitely in your grandparents' lifetime, Mount St. Helens blew. And on a much smaller scale, it did everything the flood did. It created vast devastation. It created miniature canyons. It did everything the flood did on a much smaller scale. And a few years later, everything grew back. So it is a picture of the flood that all but disproves the evolutionary theory of millions of years. There's a lot of other reasons for the evolutionary theory not making sense with the mountains, canyons, and sediment layers. It's just not the way water works. But those, especially things like the Grand Canyon, there's strong evidence for the biblical flood occurring as it was documented in the Bible. Along with that, we also have dinosaur graveyards. Now, you'll very rarely hear these things referenced. Usually you'll just hear dinosaur bones or evolutionists talking about the various dinosaurs that came along. But if you actually look at a map of where every single dinosaur bone was found, you'll realize that they were grouped. These dinosaurs, at least the majority of them, were running from the flood. So they knew the flood was coming. They were already migrating, trying to get away from it. They went to high points or peninsulas in their various portions of their landmass. Back then, it seems likely that all the continents were joined as one. So they were going out to the edge of the peninsulas, the high places, wherever the flood was not going to be right away. And they struggled to stay alive as long as they could, and they grouped themselves as the water grew higher and higher. They consolidated themselves in these peninsulas, and so especially in America here, almost all the dinosaur bones are found in two mass graveyards, what look like two ancient peninsulas, where the water was the last to overcome them. And many of these dinosaurs are buried with their necks tilted upward, as if they were struggling in the water here at the very end to try and breathe, to stay alive as the floodwaters overcame them, and then massive amounts of sediment just washed over them and buried them almost instantly. The precision of gravity. This is a big one. So, gravity is perfect on this earth for our life to exist. Mathematically, if you adjust the level of gravity by just a fraction, not even a whole number, just a fraction of a number, and make it stronger, then it would be so strong that the human body would be literally smashed into the ground. And if you were to reduce that number by just a fraction, then the human body would float off the ground. We couldn't walk. So the precision with which gravity has been finely tuned on this particular planet, just so that humans can live, is very unlikely to have occurred by itself. That is strong evidence that somebody intentionally took that gravity and tuned it correctly. Something you'll see with historical historians, secular historians, is the Egyptian Exodus timeline. Now, they like to use a part of the Bible to establish when the Exodus happened, but then they go out there and they say, well, the Exodus didn't happen here because there's no evidence for it, therefore the Bible is wrong. So it's circular reasoning that doesn't make any sense. They like to use the fact that the Bible mentions a town. The town has a name very similar to a pharaoh of the time period, and so they say, well, the Bible says this town was built by the Hebrews when they were in Egypt, therefore this is when they were in Egypt. Unfortunately, what it looks like really happened is the person who is writing the Bible at a later date simply said, well, this is the modern day of that town. So this is what town the Hebrews built while they were in Egypt. It was known by a different name back then, but this is the modern day name of it because it was renamed for a later pharaoh. So that particular reasoning of the secular historians doesn't hold water, but it is still in modern day use, and it is the number one thing that they point to when they're trying to establish an Egyptian timeline, and the number one reason why they will refuse to accept any evidence and all evidence that's been found that does support the Bible and supports the Hebrews being in Egypt at a much earlier time period, like 50 to 100 years earlier. They just say, well, even all of the evidence is there for them. That's not when the Bible says they were there. Therefore, they couldn't have been there. Therefore, the Bible's wrong. Do you see the circular reasoning going on here? One of the big things that they found Jericho. Everybody acknowledges that Jericho has been found. Its walls have been crumbled, just like the Bible says. It's been burned with fire, just like the Bible says. And they found stores of nearly full jars of grain there. That's important because if these grain houses were still full, that means that Jericho was conquered by some ancient people right about the time of the harvest. And that happens to be when the Bible said the Israelites came in and conquered them was right after the harvest. So that's strong evidence for the Bible there as well. In Egypt, we have the story of the Pharaoh who was afraid of the Hebrews, so he started having the Hebrew babies killed, all the male babies. And if you look around about the time period when the adjusted time period when we believe the Hebrews really were in Egypt, you actually do see the archaeological evidence shows that there are a significant increase in baby graves that date to that same time period. And then if you look a few years later, when those babies would have grown up, 10, 15 years, 20 years later, you see a significant increase in graves that contain female skeletons. So that would stand to reason if the dramatic increase in baby deaths were only male babies. And that does fit the biblical story of males being targeted for death by the Pharaoh of that time period, and then they all grew up, and now a bunch of women are dying because there aren't men to die. The men have already died as babies. So we actually have archaeological evidence that supports that story very well. Here's an interesting one. So the Bible talks about the great famine in Egypt that Joseph came along and helped them through. Now, me personally, when I think of a famine, I think of dry deserts, nothing grows, no food. But the Bible says that there was no planting. Now, if we'd had a famine that were due to dry spells, you'd still go out and you'd still till your fields and you'd still plant and maybe try and find some little well of water and get yourself a little bit of food. But the Egyptians couldn't even plant. Now it turns out that over in Egypt, the Nile River, even to this day, still floods every single year. And they've done a lot of core samples. They've done core samples throughout many, many generations at this point to sort of show themselves a pattern of how the Nile floods. And based on archaeological evidence and these core samples, it looks like around about this period when we believe the Hebrews were in Egypt, not the secular, but the adjusted timeline, around about the time, initially there were around about 7 years of excess flooding. So the water, which let's say the water floods to about 2 feet deep every year. It covers all the land, soaks it, prepares it for harvesting the next year, for planting and harvesting. During these 7 years, the water flooded to about 4 feet deep. That extra water provided a bunch of extra water for the plants, and they had plenty, extra food. So those were the 7 years of plenty. Now, according to these core samples, right after that initial flooding, something even worse happened. So they had much bigger floods happening for about 7 years. And then we had even larger floods, to the tune of about 8 feet of water, if I remember right. So massive flooding coming in, just overwhelming the land with water. Now you'd think that'd be great, right? It would soak into the land and now you'd have massive harvests. Unfortunately, when that much water comes in, there's a breaking point where the water can no longer seep into the ground. There's just too much of it. So the land becomes water-laden all year around. You can't plant in it because it's a pool of water. I mean, the ground is so soggy, so wet all year around that nothing can grow because you're just planting your seeds into pools of water. And so now we've got 7 years here where you can't even go out and plow or plant because the floodwaters have been so drastic that the ground isn't even available to plant. It's just too wet. And so then that brings along the 7 years of famine because they can't plant, they can't harvest because the ground's too wet to plant in. And so that evidence really supports the 7 years of plenty followed by the 7 years of famine. They've also found pyramids and such that look like they had tunnels that all fed together to store the grain in with one repository. So it's really cool. They found multiple pyramids with tunnels going underneath the pyramid all to a central exit point. And that central exit point has this sort of tunnel, narrow shaft going to it. So you've got these exit points which come into this little bin. And you've got a bunch of stalls going down this corridor they found. So people could come into this corridor. Let's assume maybe we had money changers or somebody sitting in these little stalls, and they would take people's money as they came in to buy the grain. People would wander through this corridor, get to the back. All these tunnels now from the grain-filled repositories up top, I think they were like mini pyramids, they came down and they fed grain into this trough. So people would go in, and the people who were dealing out the grain would scoop up the grain and scoop in however much they were buying, and they would go on their way. But that shows that there was a system in place for mass amounts of some sort of food to be funneled together from these massive storehouses and all centralized in one area that it could be distributed from. I think that was some pretty interesting evidence there that fits with the Bible very well. This is one that's a little bit more controversial. So there have been a couple places where they believe that they found the crossing for Pharaoh's army. One of them even has chariots and horse skeletons. I mean, everything that looks like a Pharaoh's army buried in the water for a very, very long period of time. And all the evidence points to this being the true crossing. Most secular people point to the Reed Sea, I believe it is, as being the Red Sea, but it doesn't fit any of the biblical described areas or maps. So this particular area, I'm not sure where it's at, but you can look it up online. They've actually found all these chariot wheels and everything, and that looks like it was Pharaoh's army at one point. Now, I did hear this one story that some later king came in and wanted to throw discredit on the entire story of the crossing, and so he took a bunch of chariots and horse skeletons and he threw them in the river just so that they would be there for future people to find. Is that likely? I don't know, but it is something that I've read, so be aware of it. Yes. A more modern one now that I've come across is this brilliant physicist who has been studying molecules and gravity, and he has discovered that the Earth's electromagnetic field, now this one's going to be really hard to understand, but there's a theory that actually works for creating it. So let's assume that, as the Bible says, everything was created out of water, literally everything. So the Earth was one giant ball of water, and God made other molecules, other earth molecules, iron molecules, everything out of water molecules. So every single molecule on Earth started as water. Start with that base assumption. Now, if you take all those water molecules that have electrons and point them all in the same direction, and that's something only the power of God could do, because nobody can actually rearrange water molecules and point them in the same direction. But if you get them all pointed in the same direction so that their magnetic fields are all aligned, they will create this magnetic field around the Earth. Now, obviously water molecules are not currently aligned, they're all splashing around in the ocean. So that magnetic field doesn't exist. But something funny happens when you let go of all those water molecules, so they go from being perfectly aligned to twisted out. Each molecule, as it twists, it jerks on that electromagnetic field that it created, the tiny little one, and it pulls it out of alignment, and part of that jerking process creates electricity. Now, if you take that to a large scale and every single molecule in the Earth suddenly went out of alignment and it jerked the entire magnetic field that it had created, it would create a giant electrical current throughout the entire body of water. That a giant electrical current still exists in this Earth. So evidence for this particular theory happening is in the Earth. Now this giant electrical current is circulating around inside the Earth, and it, as a byproduct of it, is now creating our current electromagnetic field that surrounds the Earth, creating our North Pole and our South Pole. So the electrical current that currently exists in the Earth, which we've found, creates the electromagnetic field around the Earth, which we can also see or measure. So that is a really good theory for how it came into being, and it fits really well with the Bible. Now, the first thing you think of is everything we know about physics, right? Things go from order to disorder. This electromagnetic current can't keep going. I mean, it's got to stop, right? That's true. The scientists who made this discovery plotted the current rate of decay, or actually he theorized it first. He theorized that if this were to happen, we'd have this giant electrical current at the beginning of creation, and it would immediately start to slow down on a logarithmic curve until it eventually stops, obviously, because an electromagnetic current, or a electrical current that has nothing feeding it is going to stop eventually. It'll just keep swimming around, but eventually it's got to stop because there's resistance. Molecules and stuff are resisting it. So he theorized that in about 6,000 years, you would see a certain level of current left. And sure enough, if we go out and we measure what we can measure, the current and the magnetic atmosphere, the results show us that the levels of our current are exactly what he says they should be based on this graph. And he's done a couple of measurements throughout the years and shows that the current is decreasing at the same rate as this graph shows that it would. So that is a great deal of evidence for his theory. Now, to back up his theory, he did this same graph for all the planets, well, I think like 6 at least, but a large number of planets in our solar system. At the time, there was no way for him to prove it, but he put this out there in a paper back then, I think it was around 2009 or so, and he said, this is what we should expect to see if my theory is right. Now, at a later date, the United States sent out a couple of space probes, and they went by these planets, and they actually measured the magnetic fields around these planets. And all of their measurements matched his theory perfectly. So it looks like God created the universe out of molecules of water. Every single body in the universe started out as an equal density of water. And this guy has also extrapolated his theory further into stars being created from water and the magnetic currents that we would see from them, and they all hold true. Everything in the universe looks like it was created originally from pure water molecules, which is really fascinating. Here's an interesting... No, let's go for this one first. There's another scientist, I haven't done a lot of research on this one, but when you have a distant galaxy, the time that it takes that galaxy's light to reach us turns the wavelengths longer. The longer light travels, the wavelengths start to stretch, they get longer. And the longer a wavelength, the redder the light looks. And so, therefore, we can measure how far away these galaxies are from us. And somebody has been, for many, many years, plotting the levels of redshift, or how red the light is from each galaxy that we can see. And they have discovered that the galaxies look like they exist in rings around us. So there's a ring of galaxies. Now obviously there's a couple of extra galaxies thrown in there that throw this thing off, but the vast majority of galaxies exist equidistant from us on all sides in a sphere around our galaxy, as if the Milky Way galaxy were the center of the entire universe, almost like somebody created it that way. And so not only is there this concentric ring of galaxy or sphere of galaxies around us, but that is repeated at specific intervals. So we got this sphere of galaxies. Now, according to these redshifts, there's another sphere of galaxies, a certain number of light years beyond that one, and then another sphere. But each galaxy in these spheres is the same number of light years from our galaxy. So they all fit in this sphere pattern, multiple spheres around us, which is interesting because it points to an order in the universe. I mean, a very specific order that evolution could never account for. I mean, that's design. You have to have design at that level. Alright, one last thing that I want to talk about here is the Book of Enoch. So the Book of Enoch has some interesting, fun little stories in it. And I'm actually slowly starting to get on board with some of the genetic modification ideas that it promotes, and the Bible seems to support a little bit. However, it has one idea in it that angels came down and coupled with human women and produced genetically impure offspring. So an angel married a woman and they had a baby, and this baby was half man, half angel, and it was this weird giant on the earth, and the Lord sent the flood to kill out all these weird things, and it's a weird story. I am aware of that story. I don't think that there's a lot of evidence for it. I think that is one of the reasons why the Book of Enoch was not included in the canon, because that story just doesn't make sense. I mean, from all the biblical studies that I've done, it doesn't make any sense. Everything I know about angels, everything I know about pre-flood, post-flood history, I don't think that part of the Book of Enoch holds water. But it is still a good thing to read, because that is really popular, especially in the fringes of Christianity, for people to talk about and to believe in, is this idea of angels coming down and marrying human women. So you should be aware of that, at least. Alright, I'm sure there's much more, and in the years to come, hopefully I will get to share this stuff with you in person. However, we don't know what the future holds, so in the event that I am gone or mentally incapable of actually speaking any of this stuff to you, hopefully this video will survive and you will be able to do your own research to prove these things that I've said, or to form your own conclusions in these various areas. Bye, everyone.